So I think that we've gotten the introductions for everyone else. I'd like to introduce Dr. Jennie Lane. She's our speaker tonight, and she is a technical advisor for the Animal Health and Livelihoods Division of Land O'Lakes International Development. She is new to the DC area, but prior to this was in Malawi for 1 year, working on a USAID-funded Livestock for Resilience program. Excellent work. Awesome. Her interest is livestock transfer for prosperity I can't read my own writing. So I'm a veterinarian, sorry. Can't write for anything. Her biggest interest is livestock transfer to provide food security and nutrition for families. I hope I'm not chopping that up too badly. She is a graduate of Michigan State University Vet School, also has an MPH from Cal Berkeley, and was an equine vet, which kudos to you for that. Also did small animal. But at this point, we'd like to go ahead and let her give her presentation tonight. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thanks to Sarah. So Sarah's a classmate of mine. We went to Michigan State. So thank you for the invitation. And just so I'm also a congressional.
Oh, is it?
Is there? Oh.
This is a temporary facility, as you might know. So
No,
in 10 months, it's going to be great.
Is that better? Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm a Leland Fellow from the Congressional Hunger Center. And the Congressional Hunger Center pairs fellows with different NGOs working in food security, ag, and nutrition. So I've been placed with Land O'Lakes International Development. And I think you said I'm a technical advisor for the Animal Health and Livelihoods Department, but I am, I guess, the department. So last year I lived in Malawi. I got back in October, and I was supporting their Livestock for Resilience project there. And I had kind of two roles. One as a technical advisor supporting the livestock aspects of the project, but then also I was investigating, looking at the pathways of impact of livestock programs and livestock transfer on household food security and resilience. So, I just want to tell a story tonight. I have a lot of, yeah, it's going. Oh.
I'm sorry.
Here we go. Oh. Okay, so it's night. We spend all day long looking at diagrams and thinking really hard. So I thought it might be nice to do some more photos and tell more of a story than tell you a lot of the nitty-gritty of my research and the formative stuff of that. So I thought it'd be better to tell a story about the importance of livestock to livelihoods in Malawi, and this is applicable to a lot of other places around the world. And to me, this is One Health at a very fundamental level. It's not antimicrobial resistance, even though we kind of had some issues with inappropriate antibiotic use and parasite resistance to dewormers. It's not zoonotic disease essentially, but we still maybe had some problems with potential zoonotic disease in laboratories. But it's just looking at how animals, livestock, and the environment are all really interrelated in this fragile community. Farmers eke out a living under really tough circumstances, they rely on their land and their crops and their livestock to support their families and to feed their kids and to pay for everything else that their life revolves around. And I think every story has some characters, and these are two of our lead livestock farmers, so community animal health workers that we train, Nelessi and Afrida, and they are kind of, the spirit of them is who I try to keep with me doing work from my desk now in DC, because they are taking care of their kids, they're helping in their community, and it's really important to remember who they are. Same thing with these kids. So these are some kids in one of the communities that we worked in, and they are just like every other kid. They're curious and they're enthusiastic, and they always followed us everywhere we went, and they're unplugged. But I think kind of keeping them in a focus of what are we doing, they're our future, they're the next generation. How do we help their parents have resilient, healthy farms and diversified livelihood options to help these kids thrive and grow and have healthy brains? So it's really important to think about. Malawi is a beautiful country, but it has some struggles. So over 90% of Malawians rely on agriculture for their income. Maize, corn, soya, peanuts, or groundnuts. Tobacco are really the predominant crops. There's a lot of work trying to diversify those crops and get into horticulture and vegetables and fruits, but there's some main crops that are the most important. There are very few irrigation schemes, so the majority of agriculture is rain-fed, and what that means is there's one rainy season in Malawi. If the rains happen like they usually historically do, they come in December, they last through about March. It rains like you would not believe there. It's just water falls from the sky in sheets of rain, but then after the rains end, there's no more rain for the rest of the year. So if you don't have rain or irrigation, you can't grow crops. And if there's no rain, your crops fail, and then you don't have any food to eat for the whole rest of the year. So this is some brand new corn growing. Looks really happy and green. It's amazing how a week of rain transformed this country from a brown, dry wasteland into a beautiful green place. But there is a definitive season in Malawi called the hunger season, and it's really real. And depending on how your crop did the prior year, it might go on for months. And then if you don't have money or income, it's really hard to pay for your next year of crops. So it can perpetuate this very negative cycle. There is also a lot of deforestation in Malawi, and this coupled with longer, drier dry periods and shorter, more intense rain periods just all couples to make a really kind of hard climatic environment to be a farmer there. So because of all that, these are just some donkeys. I love donkeys, so got to include some donkeys. These are some donkeys taking some maize home. And these are some kids. So these kids are threshing soya with a stick, and that was the most common way that soya is processed, and then it's sold for, this is right at the beginning of harvest. So that's the soya is 220 kwacha a kilo, and that is about 30 cents. So if you think about the effort that went into growing that kilo of soya, and you're getting 30 cents on it's just astonishing what people work for very little return. This is a full maize silo thing, but that's what a lot of them look like, very quick into the year. So it's going to have to think about what that looks like for a farmer. And that's your cupboard, that's your bank account, so it's things you got to think about. Because of all the challenges that I just said, farmers mitigate their risk and diversify their livelihoods with livestock. So when the crops fail, they can turn to their livestock sales for income. And then when the crops are good, they can actually purchase some livestock, so maybe a goat or two or some chickens, and use those as a form of savings. And livestock reproduce, so it's like growing interest in the bank. So For a farm in Malawi, chickens are kind of like your checking account. They're quickly and easily converted into cash for small things like oil and salt and transportation fees. Goats are saved for more kind of bigger expenses, so crop inputs, staple foods to eat. So when you run out of maize, then you might sell a goat to purchase more maize to eat. School fees, medical expenses, a roof for your house, that kind of thing. The price of livestock fluctuates intensely over the course of the year. So as soon as at the very end of the harvest, at the hunger season, before crops have matured, before you can start eating green crops, livestock prices are rock bottom. It's not the time you want to sell your livestock as a negative coping strategy because you're selling them at a loss. As soon as that harvest starts to come in, even overnight livestock prices can double, which is pretty remarkable, but that's because people now all of a sudden have food and they've diversified their livelihood options. Oops. Okay, so the project I have was, that I was part of had 3 primary activities. One was training community animal health workers to provide basic veterinary services to their community, so vaccinations for chickens against Newcastle disease and goat deworming predominantly. We worked mostly with goats and chickens. There's other small stocks, pigeons, guinea pigs, bunnies, and there are cattle, but goats and chickens are kind of the most common entryway for a lot of farmers to diversify their incomes. So we trained community animal health workers. These community animal health workers then went and trained other farmers in their communities and improved animal husbandry, so improved reproduction, feeding, housing, etc. And we also had a village savings and loan component with each project to provide really essential savings and credit opportunities for farmers in the community. And our project also gave out livestock, distributed livestock to about 1/3 of our project farmers. So we gave out either 2 doe goats or 5 chickens, so 4 hens and a cock. So this is your average village chicken. I'm a big fan of these ladies. She's not very big. She doesn't grow very fast. She doesn't make that many eggs per year, maybe 60 to 80 eggs a year. But she's really hardy, and she's really tough, and she scavenges for her own food, so you don't have to feed her anything else. And she's a really good mom to these chicks, and she knows how to run away from predators. So she's pretty well adapted to this environment. And like I said, they're easily and quickly converted to cash. But they are susceptible to this really nasty virus called Newcastle disease, which can have extremely high mortality rates, up to 100%. And it'll rip through a village, and all of the chickens will be dead within about a week or so. And it most often happens kind of at the tail end of the hot, dry, dusty period when the hunger season is just kind of getting going. So it's really can be a double whammy to those households. But there's an effective, affordable, thermostable vaccine for Newcastle disease. So getting these vaccines out to these chickens is really important. So this is actually one of our lead livestock farmers vaccinating a chicken. So a small chicken, you can vaccinate them from when they're very young. A big part of my task the last year was making sure our project distributed healthy livestock. And there are a lot of pros and cons to livestock distribution. And I personally think that with village chickens, the time and energy of a project is much better spent training community vaccinators to vaccinate more chickens than it is to buy chickens and distribute them to your farmers. It's kind of like teach a man to fish or give him a fish. Because if you look at the end of a 2-year project and you compared how many chickens you were going to have at the end of it, you gave everybody chickens or you taught everybody how to take care of their chickens better and you enabled them and they had vaccines, that you're going to have a lot more chickens at the end of the vaccine project. But that said, there are a lot of livestock projects that still do livestock transfer of chickens and lots of others. So I learned a lot of the nuts and bolts of livestock distribution. In a lot of donor-funded projects, I was part of a USAID OFTA-funded project. There are very strict procurement guidelines. So when you want to buy something as a project, you have to be fair and transparent. So you put a bid in the newspaper. You say, okay, I want our project needs 500 t-shirts, or our project needs 3,000 chickens. You put an advertisement in the newspaper, vendors submit their quotation, you go through a fair process, and you decide who you're going to buy those animals from. But it's really hard to buy 7,500 village chickens at once. They don't all grow up together, 7,500 of them. They're spread out, 3 chickens here, 4 chickens here, living in their happy homes behind their households. And if you know anything about chickens, you know that they like to die sometimes. They are very sensitive. Even though I just said this village chicken is very hardy, chickens in general, as a breed of animal, are sensitive and susceptible to stress. And just like any other creature, if you take them from their regular environment, you crowd them in new conditions, you give them new food, and you stress them out, things can go wrong. They're going to get sick. They can have problems. So our project learned that. It was, even though we had I thought, a fairly robust process of identifying chickens, vaccinating them, quarantining them, and then distributing them, we still ran into some problems and learned a lot of lessons from that. I think just broad picture of the development community, we owe it to the chickens, we owe it to the farmers, and we owe it to taxpayer dollars who are funding these projects, that we need to be really thoughtful about how we do these projects without increasing the risk, not only for the livestock, but for these farmers kind of going forward. I have a few pictures of just the livestock the chicken distribution process. So these were village chickens that had already been aggregated. So the vendor sends out his guys out into the village. They buy chickens, 3 here, 4 here, 5 here. They aggregate them. They bring them. This is actually a really nice barn for them to live in. We go and we look at them. We inspect them all and make sure they look healthy. They all get a Newcastle vaccine on day 0, and then they're quarantined for at least 10 days before they get on a truck and they drive to our distribution point. So this is how they travel, sometimes a few hours down the road. So if it's hot, there's actually a fair amount of space in there, but chickens don't like to get hot, so they can even run into problems traveling in this nice modified chicken vehicle. And then our farmers kind of all line up and they wait and they get their chickens off the truck. I said we gave out 4 hens and 1 cock. Well, that means that hopefully you have the right ratio of hens and cocks on that truck. Otherwise, it runs into a lot of problems when you say, okay, you know, this farmer is supposed to get this. You run through them, but then maybe at the end you have 50 cocks left over. And then your farmers have to come back so they can get their hens later, and now they've wasted their day, and sometimes they've come from a very far away. So there was a lot of logistics that took a long time to iron out and work with our vendors and try to explain, well, no, we need this. There's a reason why we wanted this number, and this is what we ordered, and we need them to come in this ratio, and it's tough. So then the chickens go home in the baskets, and sometimes they have a long walk too. So they started off in the morning, they ride 3 or 4 hours, sometimes a long time, maybe 3 or 4 hours, hopefully just 1 or 2 in the truck, and then they get distributed and they go home in the basket, and sometimes it's a 2 or 3 hour walk to get to where they were going. So sometimes they were quite thirsty, so we had to remind them to get them some water, and this was every time it was a process to get some water to give to our chickens. But the chickens are getting water. It's amazing. I didn't know you could actually get a chicken to drink, but when she's thirsty, she drinks a lot. In the process of learning all this, we kind of transitioned from procuring maybe 300 or 400 birds at once to doing local chicken trading. So we worked with our lead livestock farmers to identify farmers in the area who had excess chickens that they wanted to sell. So we had an artificial market day. We advertised what the price was going to be, so it was fair. All the chickens were going to be sold for the same price. People brought their chickens. They lined up. The farmers lined up. It worked out really well. The chickens that we were buying were supposedly in the vaccination program that our community animal health workers had already been done, but there's not really any way to verify that. So I think this is less risky, but there's still some risk involved that you're going to give potentially sick chickens to someone. So this is us just going through inspecting chickens. This was still hard because the right ratio didn't come to these either. And then there would be a bunch of guys selling their chickens, and I'd be picking them out of the baskets, and there was a lot of pushing and cajoling, and I would reject chickens because sometimes they didn't look good, or they were sick, or they were way too small. So it was still hard. And this actually was, though, a great opportunity for a lot of teaching with our community animal health workers, because I had a lot of time to be able to spend with them and our livestock staff about looking at chickens and what's healthy, what's not, how do we quickly assess the health of the chicken. So it was a lot of time with our farmers, which was really great. I enjoyed. We also gave out goats. Goats are a little bit easier, but they're still a learning curve. One more chicken though. So this is not a sick chicken. She doesn't have a dermatological issue with her feathers. I didn't know that. I rejected quite a few of these chickens until someone said, hey, that's not sick. It just doesn't have feathers on her neck. And the ladies like them more because they lay more eggs, apparently. I was not a chicken or a goat veterinarian before I got to Malawi, so I had a large learning curve. I didn't know that ruminants had deciduous teeth. So that's how you age a goat, is by how its teeth erupt, which I also had to learn. So this is looking at some goats. This goat was just at the high end of our age range. So she is probably close to 2.5 years old, because she has one set of adult teeth, and the gaps are new adult teeth coming in. There was also problems with our goat vendors, so we went into a community. We were on our way to go inspect about 150 goats. We were in this urban area, and I'm looking around and where the heck are there going to be 150 goats? And we pull into this kind of compound, and this is the scene. This is interesting. And this is what it looked like. So the heat that was coming out of those windows from these goats being crammed in there overnight was intense, and it was bad, and there was no food, and there was no water. It was really unfortunate circumstance. These goats actually all looked okay. They were pretty healthy to start with, but this is a stressful experience that these goats don't need to undergo. So there was a lot of education that we had to go through with the vendors and working with them. And this guy actually ended up being one of our best vendors, and we ended up buying a lot more livestock from him and worked with him a lot. It was interesting to me because I came to this situation and I was pretty appalled, honestly, and in kind of getting to know these guys, I found out that this is pretty standard, and my standards, that they saw me coming there, like, oh gosh, here she comes again. You know, she's really picky. She always rejects things. She isn't very tolerant. But there's a lot of other projects going on there, ongoing, that are procuring and distributing livestock, which means that there's kind of been this precedent that's ongoing that no one has raised the standard. So I was told later on, this guy, we got to have a really good relationship, and he says to me, you know, I've learned a lot from you. Thank you. You've kind of elevated how we think about giving out livestock, which was like, oh, okay, that's great. And this is from a vendor who we're working with. So, this was another pen of goats that I went to go look at, and these guys, it's hot. It was really hot here. There was no shade. They were really crowded. There was no water. There was no food. It was tough, and a lot of these goats had pretty bad respiratory disease and conjunctivitis, and I rejected a lot of them. And we went back. It was really sad. So I rejected them. I said, no, we're not taking them. Don't bring them to the distribution in a few days. But then we had to go back to look at more goats there, and the same pen of goats that I'd rejected the first time around were just all still sitting there, kind of festering and not doing anything. And that was hard. So working with these guys and doing a lot of education of how can we connect the vendors with the government veterinary officials to help provide them veterinary services in these areas, because our project wasn't active in the same areas where we were buying livestock from. It was an adjacent region. So this is inspecting some goats. More goat inspection when they get off the truck, so they ride in a similar truck to the chicken truck. Bigger. Okay. So That's kind of one of the pieces of the elements. The other element that I was looking at the kind of livestock pathways of nutrition. Broadly speaking, there are 4 primary pathways of how agriculture leads to nutrition outcomes. One is through direct consumption of your production. 2 is through the indirect pathway, so sale of production that you can use to purchase food. 3rd is around gender factors that impact how women in the household and how food is used. And 4th is food prices. This also really kind of underpins a lot of One Health issues. So Malawi has very high rates of malnutrition and stunting, up to almost 50%. So it's somewhere between 45 and 50% of children are stunted. So that's chronic malnutrition that leads to short height for age, but it also impacts cognitive development. And we know that animal source foods added in even a very small amount to a mostly plant-based diet can vastly improve the micronutrient content of that diet, decrease micronutrient deficiencies, improve immune function, decrease stunting, and improve cognitive function. So that's great, and we know that. And there's a lot of projects whose theory of change is based in the fact that if you give out livestock to farmers, small stock, it's going to improve their food security because they're going to eat them more. But that doesn't always happen, because earlier I told you that farmers use their livestock as savings in their checking account. So you don't eat your checking account or your savings account, especially if you know that 5 months down the road you've got to buy crops, inputs for your next crop season, or you're just waiting for the next bad thing to happen, because they are not dumb. They know that bad things and shocks happen to their households all the time. So they save their livestock for that. So from some of the research that we put into this project, we found that for chickens that were sold, 40% of them were sold, they sold the chicken to buy food. Probably not other meat, but staple crops, or oil, or maybe eggs, maybe some milk, but not likely. 60% of chickens were not sold for food. They were sold for all these other things that are here. Goats were more often sold for food, but it was almost exclusively staple foods. So bags of maize. Once the family had run out of their maize for that year, they're going to buy maize to get them till their next harvest. In Malawi, the staple food is called sima, which is a maize porridge that's boiled to kind of the consistency of thick mashed potatoes, and then you eat it with a type of relish, which is usually kind of a plant, chopped up spinach or kale, or maybe some tomatoes and some onions and beans if you're lucky. So we found that most often these livestock are not going directly into the direct consumption pathway, which has a lot of implications for when you think about, well, how are these livestock projects affecting food security and nutrition? And then there's these giant development projects that have livestock as a component of them, but they're agriculture projects, but they're not necessarily seeing impacts on stunting like you'd hoped. Well, it gets back to maybe the theory of change and how farmers use their livestock is wrong, or how do we think about behavior change messaging around how we get farmers to get them over the hump to how many animals do they need to be able to eat. And this just gets a little bit more into, so the households that it's cut off, but at the top, it's how many households ate any chickens at all. So 52% of households ate a chicken of their household, and if they ate them, it was only 2.5 chickens. Only 19% of households consumed goats of their own at all, and it was 1.8 goats. And that's most often for holidays or festivals or funerals. Okay. We did find that a lot of households are eating eggs, which is super. Eggs are kind of a miracle food when it comes to improving micronutrient deficiencies in kids. But 71% of those eggs that were consumed are purchased. So they're not coming from the hens in the backyard. They are coming from the kiosk down the road. And that's because for these farmers, for a village chicken, a fertilized egg has a lot more potential in their mind for the possibility that it has to turn into another chicken than it has to improve the family nutrition. So there's a lot kind of more active research of, well, how many chickens do we need to have before there's enough to be able to sell those, keep enough eggs to maintain your chicken flock, grow your flock, eat some eggs, and maybe sell them for income too. We don't have the perfect number on that, but it's really interesting things to think about when you're thinking about development programming. These are some goats at the market, but you know that these goats are not getting back into the most vulnerable households' diets. These are goats that have been sold and now are being kind of barbecued, or you go and you get lunch on the side of the, I really like goat meat, so it was fine for me to see this. You kind of get to go and pick your cut, but this is not getting into the most vulnerable households' diets. One of the most important and strongest findings that came out of the research was how important and how successful the BSLAs were. So all of our livestock producer groups were part of a village savings and loan association, which is usually about 15 to 20 members, predominantly women. And smallholders are really at the center of production for most agricultural products, but they're often left out of most formal banking systems, and they have a really hard time accessing credit. So through a BSLA, even the very poorest farmers could save as well as access credit, small amounts of credit for maybe starting a business, if you need a small loan for meeting kind of an immediate household need, or bigger household shocks. And about 80% were women, and they consistently reported that this empowered them. Husbands started to come and ask them for money. I mean, it really gave them the ability to save and plan in the future. And the other thing this does is having access to savings can turn your livestock into hard savings. So you sell those livestock when the price is really high, right after harvest, when there's none on the market now all of a sudden. But the more urban centers still have a demand for animal protein. And then they can kind of keep on taking small loans for living expenses during the year, as opposed to having to tap into that livestock asset base and kind of notch away at it a little bit, so they can grow their herd. And then it can become this larger self-sustaining entity that then they can maybe use to buy, to eat eggs, or especially eggs, or eat chicken meat, as opposed to having to purchase them. And I actually was just at a resilience workshop for the last 2 days, thinking about how to improve resilience in development programming, and they looked at all sorts of adaptive capacities that households need to kind of mitigate risk. If they have a shock, how do they return to their kind of normal and continue in their upward trajectory? And access to credit and savings is the number one thing that they identified that helps mitigate risk and makes households more resilient. And it's really because they don't have to tap into their livestock base as much, because they can access credit when they need to, and they have savings. So it was nice because it was a little bit validating that we found the same results in our much smaller study. So when I was in Malawi, I also got involved with some other One Health activities, which were really interesting. I volunteered with a rabies vaccination campaign called Mission Rabies. So Malawi has the highest rate of rabies deaths in the world, but it's been found that it's pretty well established if you can get rabies deaths from dog bites in children. And if you can get the dog vaccination coverage rate to 70%, herd immunity takes over the rest. So I volunteered with this, which was really cool. And they, as a UK organization, they have some really advanced kind of mapping and app technology that they use in their projects. So you know exactly where you've gone. They know how many kind of the vaccination density that they've achieved, the coverage, which is really a neat thing to be part of in the community. The little girl with her dog come to school. It was many, many, many kids brought dogs, and a fair number of cats too. This is the Mulanje Mountain. It was beautiful. There's a very active Malawi Wildlife Conservation Society there. Malawi is not as well known as its neighbors like Tanzania and Zambia for its wildlife, but if you're ever in the area, safari in Malawi is really nice. They have incredible birding, and there's some big efforts in the country to provide job and livelihood opportunities for people, especially around wildlife national parks, to discourage poaching. They have alternate livelihood activities. They're less likely to poach livestock as well as trees, which is deforestation is a big issue for predominantly charcoal production. But, it's really kind of supporting livelihoods is imperative to building some wildlife populations there. And a good friend of mine is a wildlife veterinarian in Malawi, so I got all sorts of stories. And this is a rhino, so I got to go rhino tracking in Malawi, which was really cool. And you go on foot in the bush, and you get to see rhinos, which was awesome. The wildlife center there has a very active volunteer program. So one day I got to take one of the veterinary students who was a volunteer out with me to vaccinate chickens. And even though he gets to play with, he's worked with amazing wildlife all over the world. He said vaccinating chickens days was one of his favorite days in Malawi. So this whole crew of kids helped us. They were really good helpers. So to wrap up, I just want to express my gratitude to Congressional Hunger Center because they support my fellowship, and to Land O'Lakes. These women were some of the team that I worked with, and this is on the shores of beautiful Lake Malawi. So we got to go here for a retreat, which was really nice. And my family for their support. I think Land O'Lakes is really committed to understanding and adopting a One Health approach in their programming. It might not be that they've explicitly stated that, but you listen to their ideas and how they think about things, and it's certainly One Health. And I think the development community in general needs more veterinarians and One Health-oriented people involved, some scientific brains that kind of understand One Health principles and very broad systems level thinking. So I can talk a lot more about this. I'm always trying to get involved with other things. There is the AVMA Global Food Security Summit that's coming up next month, so if you're interested, check that out. And there may be some veterinary students out here in the webinar land. It's a hard field to get into, so be persistent. I didn't apply to this job as a veterinarian. It wasn't a veterinary job that I applied to, so you have to kind of get creative about how to get involved with this. So I think that's, so thank you.
Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, Jenny, thank you very much. Organizations like Heifer and others, have been using approaches like this over many, many, many years.
Mm-hmm.
What's different about Land O'Lakes in this particular project? Was it a learning experience for you, or was it for Land O'Lakes, or are they just getting into this? I don't quite understand why. I guess what I'm trying to say is, it seems like there's been so much practice in trying to give animals to rural people. They ought to have it perfect by now, but apparently they don't. What comments would you have?
They don't. Land O'Lakes has been in this community, active in this community as well for a long time. So Land O'Lakes International Development is a separate but very related entity to Land O'Lakes corporate, so the Butter people. It just split off as a 501c3 this past a year ago, January. But since the 1980s, Land O'Lakes has been involved with international development activities, most starting with dairy cooperatives based on the dairy cooperative experience that Land O'Lakes has really deep expertise with in the U.S. for a long time. Heifer, Land O'Lakes, there are some other organizations that have been doing livestock transfer for a very long time. Save the Children, Mercy Corps, there's a lot of pastoralist programming that involves livestock transfer. I don't know why we don't have it right. There are a lot of reasons. I'm very new to this community. I think, but one of the things that I recognized was when I was in Malawi, talking to the guys in the field, you heard time after time after time of, oh yeah, that project did that and it didn't do well. Oh yeah, that project didn't, they gave out chickens, oh the chickens died. Oh, they gave out goats, the goats died. Oh yeah, the government did that project and goats are nowhere to be seen. So I think it gets to the foundation of, well, is giving out livestock the best option for a lot of these projects? What's more cost effective? There haven't been really well-funded cost-effective studies. That's the donor.
You're discouraging me. I keep getting a sheep every year, and I don't know if it's worthwhile.
I have also given out plenty of Christmas presents as sheep and goats and support a family. And livestock programming in itself needs to continue. Absolutely. But I think we need to be a little bit more deliberate about how we think about giving out livestock and if it's the most appropriate, cost-effective modality or if there's other options, like supporting community vaccinators and community health workers and improving the livestock that they have there. You know, after, especially in pastoralist communities, restocking efforts are sometimes maybe really necessary things to do. Supporting livelihoods and women's empowerment and doing very small stock like pigeons and guinea pigs and rabbits and things. There's a lot of kind of highly contextual things for individual projects that might be more appropriate. So, does that answer your question?
That's kind of what I was expecting you to say, but thank you.
I think that sorry, we can talk later. Daniel.
Yes, thank you for your talk. As you know, I have been in Malawi also, and as a pediatrician over there, I faced quite a huge number of malnourished children under my care. And one issue that I observed at the time was the road runners actually cost much more than the frozen chicken over there. Road runners is the chicken from the factory. That's how they call it over there. And to raise the chicken in the backyard of their house for self-consumption will not be cost effective.
Yeah.
When they buy frozen chicken, it's much lower cost. At the time when the exchange rate was about 100 kwacha to $1, the frozen chicken cost only 100. And while the road runners may cost 50 and calculating this economy, can you assess issues that chicken raised through your program can be positive contribution towards malnutrition issue, or more or less indirect? Because sometimes we feel that the food security aspect of it for health might need to consider other solutions rather than directly involving this kind of
No, I agree completely. So there's for the webinar, people that might not be able to hear that, it's talking about cost difference between local chickens, which are called roadrunner chickens, and kind of more commercial chickens, which there is a growing availability of kind of supermarket chicken that come frozen. Those are predominantly only available in urban areas, and also implied there is you have refrigeration, or you have access to the urban area where your refrigeration, you buy a very small amount because there's no way to keep it safe after about a day, right? You don't want to eat chicken that's been sitting out. So that's one piece. And the other piece of the question was about how do these village chicken projects affect nutrition, right? Yeah, so that is not a linear pathway, and it's very complicated. Even though a lot of projects rely on the fact that they think you can give out chickens or you can improve the chicken population and they're going to be immediately eaten. But it takes, so in talking to some other colleagues that I know who do a lot of the same chicken work and looking at stunting in surrounding areas, so Tanzania and Zambia, they have found that it takes more than 2 years for a chicken project, like only exclusively community vaccinating and improved husbandry, housing, and feeding practices. It takes over 2 years for that project to be ongoing before they'll start to see high enough chicken flock size to see an increase in the consumption of animal source foods in the household. So it just gives you an idea of kind of what project funding cycles need to look like, what sort of behavior change communications that need to be paired with those projects, what other sorts of elements need to be there. So we need to talk about WASH, so water, sanitation, and hygiene. Do we need to talk about where those chickens live? Do they live in the house with the family? Do they live in an external chicken house? Do we talk about kind of food preparation, infant, young child feeding practices? Do we have the moms wash their hands? Do we have the babies get their hands washed so they're not eating chicken feces? I mean, there's a lot of other elements that are at play. So.
Sorry, I can say.
That's okay. Do you want to talk into the microphone?
Thank you. Sorry, I can say. So I might have missed something. I'm wondering, in your project, is there any plan of using antibiotics for animals, or do you have any strategy to avoid misuse of antibiotics for livestock?
Allow me to introduce.
Okay.
My former colleague in Malawi, she's a pharmacist working for MSH. She has been in Malawi for 9 years. And I was fully supported by her with all these difficult procurement of drugs at the time. So, Judy won.
That's a great question. Antibiotic usage, training our farmers, community animal health workers in appropriate antibiotic usage, working with the government partners that we worked with in all the aspects. So there are government veterinary officers and assistant veterinary officers who are project paired with in every district. That is a really hard question. Our project did not distribute antibiotics to our community animal health workers. There are kind of restrictions. Antibiotics is a restricted good for USAID, so we can't buy antibiotics and give out to farmers. But our farmers did receive training in using predominantly oxytetracycline and like amprolium, so some of the coccidiostats, for chicken diseases mostly. And that's about it. There's really limited availability of some antibiotics, especially out in the rural areas where our farmers were, and cost is a huge issue too. So, but there's not a discrete statement that we have as an organization and that I've been able to find in a lot of other organizations that do livestock work on how they use livestock. And I think it kind of always gets delegated to the project, what sort of context they're working in, what sort of government official, what the local government policy is, and what the government officials are doing. So, but it's a really important, well-received point.
Sure. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the vaccine availability. I know you said you offered vaccines to provide vaccinated birds and goats, I think, a little bit, but moving forward, for the farmers to continue that, what the vaccine availability is, and also whether there are any government-sponsored vaccination programs.
Yeah, great question. So our project actually did not give out any vaccine to our community animal health workers either. They had to buy it. So our community animal health workers, it was an income-generating activity. So we gave that, they did receive a bicycle. They received a little box, like a hardware toolbox, and a cooler box. And then they received skills and training in how to vaccinate chickens. And we worked with the government suppliers and kind of the local veterinary supply chain to create the connections that our livestock farmer groups, they were formed into groups. They had a chair. We connected them with the veterinary supply company so they could kind of come together and group buy when they needed to buy vaccine. The goats didn't get vaccinated. There were goat vaccinations for anything there. We basically got dewormed with fenbendazole because that was about what was available, which opens a whole other box of problems. But as far as vaccination production and government vaccine programs, there is one laboratory in Malawi that makes vaccine against Newcastle disease. Central Veterinary Lab has a vaccine production unit, which works very closely with an Australian NGO, the Rural Poultry Center, Malawi Rural Poultry Center. I might have messed that name up. That also has been doing community animal health worker training and community vaccinated training for a very long time. The VPU, so Newcastle disease is this particular vaccine called I2. It's a wet strain of vaccine. It's a live vaccine. It's made by I don't know all the specifics, but you make it by incubating chicken eggs, and then you somehow get the vaccine out of the chicken eggs. To make vaccine, you need eggs. You need hens to lay those eggs. To have hens lay eggs, they need food to eat. There was a lot of problems with vaccine production unit capacity not working at its full capacity because there weren't necessary inputs, like food for the chickens all the time. So the demand for I2 vaccine far exceeded sometimes the amount of vaccine that was made. There are other vaccines available. They're not as thermostable. So I2 is thermostable, so it can be out of the refrigerator. There's some well-documented charts on how long it can be out of the fridge, but it can, out in the field, it can last for a few days if kept in a nice kind of cool, wet area in a clay jar and covered up, which is good in this area where there's very limited refrigeration. As far as government vaccination programs, there are some. A lot more of them are kind of through local NGOs and other international NGOs that are working with vaccination programs in other parts of the country. There could be a lot more to be done with coordination, coverage. You get to some area, and one of our project was active in an area where there was National Rural Poultry Center, that's what it is, was active in another part of that same district, so there might have been some overlap. So kind of foresight and, well, where do we want this project to be? Where are there gaps? Where do we need to go? That's an ongoing question there. I participated in some stakeholder meetings for Newcastle disease vaccine problems in Malawi and chickens, and it was a really interesting process learning about that.
I'm just wondering how you decide, your organization decide on who would participate, who would get the chickens, and then what commitment did the family have back to the project to be part of?
So, working with the government, they decided districts that they wanted the project to be in, and local government stakeholders, they identified certain village development communities within those districts where the project would be active. Once they determined the geographic area, and that comes from mission office in Malawi, so USAID mission office in Malawi working with government of Malawi, Department of Animal Health and Livestock and other stakeholders to determine where they want the project to be. Once that was determined, there was selection criteria for the project, so they held kind of sensitization meetings in communities, talked about the project, and for farmers to be able to be eligible, they actually had to have some livestock. So we were not working with the most vulnerable, poorest of the poor households. They had to at least have had 1 or 2 chickens or a goat if they were going to be in a goat group. So farmers broke off into either goat groups or chicken groups. So that's how they kind of, and there were some other criteria, household size, income, land holdings, livelihood assets, that also kind of determine their eligibility. Once farmers were enrolled in the program and were kind of members of producer groups that each one of our community animal health workers kind of teed up with in combination with the village agent who ran the Village Savings and Loans Association. All the households received training in improved animal husbandry. So after the project had been active for about a year, they went through a household selection process where we were out in the field and every single household was evaluated for kind of showing if they were doing improved practices. So had they built an improved chicken house or a goat structure? Did they still have livestock? Did they still fit the criteria of a widow, person living with HIV/AIDS, certain number of kids, elderly, still income levels? So every household was scored, but they definitely had to have built an improved housing structure, and they had to be showing that they were still taking care of the livestock, the few livestock that they might have had beforehand. That's how they were selected.
Well, if everyone could help join me in thanking Dr. Lane for her So, as is customary for the One Health Academy, we'd like to present you with a flag that flew over the Capitol building and certificate of author. Don't know if it was when it was being remodeled or framed or posted, but it was from the Capitol as a thank you of your time this evening.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. I welcome more questions offline, or if you want to get in touch, shoot me an email.
And then just as a housekeeping measure, as you leave, there is a trash can coming around the corner. If you could dispose of your plates, and then any glasses, if we could return them to the bar, we would greatly appreciate that. And then everyone have a great evening, and we will have another one next month. I'm not sure if we have ours.
We do have a speaker, but I do not, off the top of my head, remember who it is.
And that's where we'll hopefully be back next week to enlighten us. And look for emails. And again, please sign the sign-in sheet if you're not on there. We'll distribute that to everyone. And if you are not on the listserv, just put a star next to your name. We'll make sure we get you on there. Thank you, everyone.
That's great.